Welcome everybody to Heritage University tonight. Today, we're going to be talking about Joshua. So if you didn't get a handout, I think everybody's got one. If you didn't, Valissa and Denver back there have been very helpful, and I'm thankful for them. But I want to use really every minute we can tonight. As we go over Joshua, I feel like this every week. There's so much information to cover on each one of these books that we, go over in 1 hour. It's kind of crazy to think that we do it that way, but I don't know any other way to do it to get through the whole Testament and semester. And so at this point, we've been through the entire Pentateuch. And what I've tried to present to this point is that when it comes to understanding the law, the Torah, the Pentateuch, all of those are names for the same group of books. It's necessary to really remember that the law isn't just a rigid set of do this, don't do that. The law is built upon, first, a relationship with God that comes through a covenant, but also it's built upon the premise that faith is necessary for obedience to be possible. So it's not simply enough to go through the rituals, your heart has to be in the right place. And so last week, we looked at Deuteronomy and its emphasis on love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And this idea that love for God is the absolute foundation of the law, and that any other compliance, whether you're doing the right things or not, is unacceptable. So Genesis, we talked about the importance of faith with Abraham. Exodus, we talked about Sinai, God creating a nation. Leviticus, what was necessary for God to dwell with that nation. Numbers, we saw the lack of faith in the wilderness generation. And then in Deuteronomy, we saw the new generation going into the promised land, being told once more, hey, you have to love God and follow him. Now, we're going to come into Joshua, and Joshua is a fascinating book for many reasons. I mean, you think the Battle of Jericho, or you think of many other things that take place in the book of Joshua. But Joshua is also, I think, one of the most disturbing books in the Old Testament. At least in terms of when we look at what God requires of the Israelites in terms of going and taking over the promised land, I think, honestly, some of the deepest reservations that we have in looking at the Old Testament come from the book of Joshua and the commands that God gives to the Israelites as they go and take over the promised land. And so we're going to look at all of those things as best we can in the next 50 minutes or so. But I want you to have your questions ready, and I hope we have a really good discussion tonight. First thing we're going to do is look over the basic content of it. So the division of Joshua, just trying to give us an overview of the book. When you think about the first 5 chapters of Joshua, this is basically like a transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua, but it's also preparing for entering the promised land. So the people of Israel are about to go into the promised land. They cross over the Jordan River. We see echoes and kind of resonances of between Joshua and Moses. But really, the first 5 chapters are preparation. Next 6 chapters or so, chapters 6 through 12, are the Conquest of Caden. The story of Jericho is very important at the beginning of that. And you can see there it's broken down basically into 3 different conquests. The central conquest, the Israelites go to the promised land kind of in the middle. They then go south, and then they go north. So it's kind of like they split it in half, south and then north. But all of those chapters describe the conquest. Then, once they've basically established their military might in the promised land, we see the division of the land based on the 12 tribes. That's what we see in Joshua 13 through 21. And then, then we see in Joshua 22 through 24, this kind of preparation to dwell permanently, as well as some misunderstanding that happens between some of the tribes. And so big picture, again, Joshua is a book about the handoff. How is Israel going to act after Moses? Will they obey God and take over the land? Once they do take over the land, how will they then apportion the land? And what does that have to do with Israel as a nation as we come to the end of the book of Joshua? So that's a big picture overview. I want to talk about Joshua for just a moment. We've already met Joshua at this point in the story. So when we think about Joshua, first, he's an assistant to Moses. Now, Joshua at that point was a relatively young man. I mean, he was younger than Moses, which may not be saying much, but in any case, he was an assistant to Moses. We see that in Exodus 24. He was also a warrior. So he led, I believe it was against the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17. So he was someone who led the people in war. He was also, of course, one of the faithful spies. Remember that Moses sent 12 men, one from each tribe. Caleb and Joshua were the two who said, hey, we can take this. So we know that he was a spy as well. We know he was the leader who succeeded Moses, and we see that in Joshua chapter 1 and following, as he really takes over the reins, and God really demonstrates to the people that he was with Joshua just as he was with Moses. But then the amazing thing, and this is really kind of cool to think about from a faithfulness standpoint, is that Joshua was one of those rare figures who, though imperfect, he did trust God really throughout his entire life. So that famous passage of, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, that kind of thing that's, everywhere at Hobby Lobby. And, if you don't have that posted in your house somewhere, you're probably a heathen, those kind of things. That came at the end of Joshua's life, okay? So he was challenging the Israelites at the end, saying, hey, now that we're in the promised land, you're either going to follow God or you're going to follow the false gods. But as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. We will serve the Lord. So from really beginning to end, Joshua figures pretty much positively in the story of Israel, okay? I want to talk a little bit about Joshua 1 through 4. And this is just a little bit of an overview, but basically here's how the story unfolds in Joshua 1 through 4. First, God comes to Moses, and essentially the first thing that God says to Joshua is, hey, Joshua, my servant Moses is dead. And this is where in our mind, it's like, man, where's kind of the sympathy that goes along with this? But it's like, hey, Joshua, your mentor, your hero, the one who led everyone and you looked up to, all right, he's gone, and now the question is, how will you assume the mantle? Moses is dead, but God promises him, but I will be with you just as I was with Moses. And this is the comfort that Joshua receives. God commands him 3 times that famous promise, be strong and courageous. Why? Because I will be with you wherever you will go. And so Joshua assumes command. And then it's interesting because the author of Joshua, which by the way, Joshua doesn't sign his name as the author. Joshua is the traditional author. It's traditionally ascribed to him. We don't know that for sure. So I don't think it's like a hill to live or die on. But in any case, the author of Joshua, for the sake of clarity, we're going to call him Joshua. When he wrote the book, he did it in such a way to really match the events of Moses' life with the events of Joshua's life. Or we could say it like this: God seems to have intentionally done similar things with Joshua at the helm as he did with Moses. And here's the point. It was to demonstrate to the Israelites that Joshua truly was the appointed and anointed leader. Okay, so when you think about Old Testament Israel, did they have leadership problems? Yes. I mean, it seems like every other week, Moses had to deal with some uprising saying, well, we don't want to follow Moses. Well, we don't want to follow Moses. Well, we don't want to follow Moses. God's not really with him. So think of it like this. God, in an act of mercy, says to Joshua, I'm going to prove to everyone that I'm with you so that you don't have the same kind of uprisings and rebellions that Moses had. And it's very fascinating. For instance, Joshua chapter 3, as God brings the people of Israel into the promised land, he has them go across the Jordan River. How? On dry land. Okay, so it was a similar thing as them going through the Red Sea. Remember, God parted the waters of the Red Sea, and God essentially says in Joshua 3, I'm going to do the exact same thing. The Ark of the Covenant, you remember the story, the Ark of the Covenant goes before them. As soon as the priests stepped foot in the Jordan River, which was overflowing its banks, it said that the river stopped, and there was essentially a wall, and they walked through the Jordan River on dry ground, just as they had the Red Sea. Also, it's very interesting, Joshua also meets an angelic mediator. And this is at the end of Joshua 5, the beginning of Joshua 6. And this angelic mediator says of himself, I am the commander of the Lord's armies. And actually, if you look at this passage, it's fascinating because Joshua is the leader of Israel. Israel is God's chosen people. He meets this man, and you can look at it yourself. I'm looking here at Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 and following. Joshua asks this man as he walks up to him, this angelic mediator, he asks him, are you for us or are you for our enemies? At which point, the commander of the armies of God, the angelic host's commander, says to Joshua, actually, I'm for neither. At which point, we would think, well, isn't the right answer that you're for Israel, right? I mean, if God is for Israel, wouldn't the commander of God's armies be for Israel? And I think it's so fascinating because it reminds us, and we're going to see this in a moment with Rahab too, that God's purposes even, and don't miss this, God's purposes even in giving the Israelites the promised land wasn't simply so that the Israelites could be there and party. It was so that they could fulfill God's promise to Abraham that he would bless all nations. So when the commander of God's army says, hey, I'm not for you and I'm not for them, it's essentially God's way of reminding all of us that even though God chose the people of Israel, he chose them for a specific purpose. Remember back to Exodus 19 that they would be a kingdom of priests, a missionary nation essentially. Okay? But what's also interesting, and this is where we see the parallel between Moses and Joshua, whenever Joshua sees this angelic mediator, he realizes that this is essentially the angel of Yahweh because the angel says to Joshua, just as he did to Moses in Exodus 4, take off your sandals because the place where you're standing is holy ground. Some people argue that this is a picture of the pre-incarnate Christ. We don't have time to kind of launch into that debate, but I just want to let you know some people think that that's possible. In any case, Joshua is pitted in these first chapters of the book of Joshua as a new Moses, a new leader of Israel who is now tasked to bring them into the promised land and to achieve victory under God. Now, this is where the story gets interesting because, like any good military leader does, Joshua sends spies to scout out the land. And those spies end up going into Jericho and they find themselves hidden in the house of Rahab. Now, Rahab is described as a prostitute in the scriptures. She's someone who basically was the head over what we might call a brothel. But remember, Jericho is a military outpost. So don't think of this as just like, what you might normally associate with like a brothel or something like that. It was something that was particularly used apparently to kind of... you know what it was, but it had a military connotation to it, okay? I'm getting a little tongue-tied there. I'm not really sure how to describe it, but in any case, Rahab, she protects the two Israelite spies hiding in her home, okay? Now, you may remember her home is on the outer wall. That's going to become part of the story later. But here is what's so fascinating. Rahab, at the beginning, tells us a lot about how the Canaanites understood what was happening and what was going on. And this is going to be important in terms of trying to figure out, okay, how could God command the Israelites to destroy everyone, man, woman, young and old? How could he command this? Well, part of it is that Rahab, and we'll talk about this more in depth later, but I want you to see this piece. Rahab apparently knows who God is. Because she doesn't just describe the God of Israel as like, El Shaddai or some kind of generic name of God. She actually uses the covenant name Yahweh. And look at this with me. She invokes that covenant name and says that the fear of the Israelites had fallen on the inhabitants of Canaan. In other words, think about this. The inhabitants of Canaan knew that the Israelites were coming. It wasn't like the Israelites, they didn't wander for 40 years. So if you knew anything, you knew the Israelites were out there. The Canaanites knew that the Israelites were on their way. And they apparently knew, she says this, when we heard this, we lost heart and everyone's courage fails because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. So think about this. You have a Canaanite woman whose theology is right on, right? Your God, the God of the Israelites, is God of heaven. He's the God of the earth. And if that's true, then God is in control of his land. Then God is in control of the people, at which point the people of Canaan were faced with a question. Are we going to bend our knee to the God of the heavens and the earth, or are we going to rebel against him? So it wasn't like they just woke up one day and said, oh, the Israelites are here. Oh, no. They knew they were coming. They knew the claims that the God of the Israelites had on the land, and yet they chose to remain. Let's keep going. Of course, Rahab hid the spies. She tricked the people who came looking for the spies, sent them the wrong way, and she made a deal with the spies, saying, okay, I have saved you. So when you go back, make an oath to me. And she told them, she actually made them swear by the Lord, the name of God. Swear to me by the Lord that you will spare me. At which point the spy said, everyone who's in your house is safe, and they were good on their promise. When the Israelites eventually came to Jericho, they protected Rahab. Rahab, of course, had to put the scarlet thread outside of her window to show who she was so that she'd be protected. And so she's spared. She eventually assimilates, and this is so important too, she assimilates into the Israelite people, becomes essentially one of them, and Rahab eventually makes it into the genealogy of Jesus, which is fascinating for a number of reasons, but I want to point this out at the beginning. God commands the Israelites to go clear out the promised land, but apparently there were certain exceptions, namely those people who, like Rahab, were willing to say, think of the words of Ruth, may your God be my God, your people my people. In other words, the Canaanites, with Rahab being an example, did not universally rebel against God. Some of them decided, hey, instead of fighting against God, would God allow us to be part of his people? At which point Rahab became part of his people, and then eventually makes it into the genealogy of Jesus. So Rahab is evidence that God's command to destroy Canaan did not include those who turned from their ways and trusted in the God of Israel. And it also shows us that all of the people of Canaan apparently did have a chance to repent. We're going to talk about that more in a few moments. But Rahab is important not just for her own sake. She's an incredible figure, obviously a very clever woman in terms of being able to secure the salvation of her family. But she really shows us an example at the beginning that God's intention wasn't extermination. Some people kind of like label the conquest of Caden genocide or ethnocide or something like that God was into ethnic extermination. Well, that's not true. And we know that from the very beginning based on Rahab, okay? Now, Jericho, the walls come down. You know this, okay? Jericho is essentially Israel's first test when it comes to the promised land. And here's why I say test, because you know what God commands them, okay? God commands them to march around the city one time for 6 days. Then on the seventh day, they march around the entire city 7 times. Then what do? Well, they don't set off a bomb, or they don't, launch a catapult. They didn't have catapults. I'm being facetious, right? But the point is, what did? They shouted. In other words, Jericho wasn't, in that sense, a military victory. It was a divine victory. And that's exactly the point. God is saying to the Israelites, listen, I'm not sending you into the promised land so you can prove how powerful you are as a military might. I'm sending you to the promised land so that I can deliver it to you. I am giving it to you. You have to follow my directions. And this is the next point. The conquest of Jericho occurs under what's called Cherem, or the total dedication of war spoils to the Lord. And this is where we start to kind of grimace a little bit. How do we understand Cherem? How do we understand that all of the spoils of war, all of the gold, all of the silver, and apparently all of the people were dedicated to God in what could be called sort of the Israelite version of holy war? And we're going to talk about that as we go, but I want you to see that's where it begins, is in Jericho, where all of the war spoils go to the Lord. Now here's the point. God is not trying to say to the Israelites, okay, I want you to be a military people who go and become rich by winning a bunch of wars. Okay, do you see that? God is not trying to give them a bunch of like military victories and then make them rich. No, God is trying to build a trust in his people, so that whatever they gain in war, they dedicate to him, aka they can't use it for their own advantage, at which point they don't become sort of a rapacious, avaricious kind of people who just go to war in order to get rich. But God uses that means of victory to show he will be the one who delivers the promised land to the Canaanites. Now, this was very interesting to me, and I never thought about this, but there was a scholar who argued it, and so I wanted to put it in here. Some argue that even by God telling the Israelites to march around Jericho so many times, it was actually giving them a chance to surrender. In other words, God was demonstrating, we're going to talk about the Canaanites more in depth later, but God perhaps was giving them a chance to recognize, hey, the Israelites are here. God has given them the land. Let's raise the white flag and surrender, or else God truly is going to come and judge us. Some people argue that, and that ultimately God was trying to give them advance warning, as he did with the prophets many times, repent or else face the judgment. That's something worth considering, okay? As the story continues, you have the Israelites failing to heed God's command to dedicate all of the war spoils to him. So you have this story of Achan that begins in Joshua chapter 7. Okay, Achan is someone who basically took some of the war spoils. He took some of the silver and gold, took it for himself, and I think there was some cloak and other things that he took as well, buried it in his tent. Basically, he saw it and said, hey, it looks good. I want it. It's free. Takes the war spoils, buries it in his tent, and then tells no one. Well, the next battle, the Israelites go to Ai, and they send basically a smaller force, but the force gets routed in war, at which point they come back, and it says that their hearts melt like water, at which point all of the Israelites are kind of like, oh no, is this a huge mistake? Are we about to get beaten? And instead of trusting in God, they basically say, oh man, like our faith, it just shattered instantly. Now, this is a problem in multiple ways. Like one, the hearts of the people are now, like water, they're melting, but also because Achan didn't commit his sin, he didn't admit his sin, the punishment was very severe. Okay, and here's the point. God is saying to his people, when I say dedicate something to me, I mean dedicate it to me. Again, I didn't bring you here so that you could think, oh, this is like the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme. God just, knocks the walls down and now we all get rich. No, this belongs to me. I want you to rely on me. Why? Because you are meant to be a holy people if you are going to live in a holy land. And as he does this, Achan eventually is chosen by Lot. It comes down to him, and God's punishment is severe. Achan and his entire family are killed. At which point, after they're killed, the Israelites fight once again at Ai, but this time they are victorious. So here's the point. Obey God, he blesses. Disobey God, he curses, right? This is basically right from Deuteronomy, an immediate application of it in the book of Joshua. This is to state how seriously God takes the idea that he and he alone receives glory and honor for all of the victory, as well as the idea that his people have to give him perfect obedience. Achan tried to hide it, and God punished him for it. Now, this passage in Joshua 8, I want us to look at briefly. You may remember in Deuteronomy, Moses predicted that they would go into the land, and Moses commanded them, when you do, I want you to renew the covenant that God made with you. And he actually told them, he said, I want half of you to go to Mount Ebal. I want the other half to go to Mount Gerizim. These were mountains that were in central Israel, okay? I want you to go there. I want you to renew the ceremony. I want you to renew the covenant and have a ceremony where half of you are on one mountain, half of you on the other. It represents kind of the blessings and the curses. Which way will you choose? And in Joshua chapter 8, they do go through this ceremony. Now notice, and you can look at this in your Bible, Joshua 8:33 actually says, and I'm going to read it here, Joshua 8:33, all Israel, resident, alien, and citizen alike, with their elders, officers, and judges, stood on either side of the ark of the Lord's covenant, facing the Levitical priests who carried it. So the author here is so intentional about including the fact that there were foreigners. It's a reminder to us, again, the idea of driving the people out of the promised land wasn't because God wanted some kind of like ethnically pure people. It's that God wanted a people who were totally faithful to him. So think about this, and again, we'll talk about this more as we go. It wasn't so much that God was worried about the Canaanites as a people, as it was that God did not want the Canaanite people to infect Israel with their false religion. It was more about the religion of the Canaanites. In fact, it was about the religion of the Canaanites. It wasn't about the ethnicity of the Canaanites. How do we know? There were foreigners even in the covenant renewal ceremony, among whom one of was Rahab and her family, right? So it's just important to remind ourselves that, all the way through the scriptures, and especially even in the Old Testament, we see this emphasis on the neighbor and the foreigner, the neighbor and the foreigner. Yes, God chose the Israelite people, but it was always for the purpose and with the recognition that foreigners were going to be included as part of God's plan. Joshua read all the words of the law. The Israelites committed to follow it and accepted the blessings and the curses. Okay? So, important moment, basically, okay, now we're in and we're going to recommit ourselves to God before we continue the conquest. Major moment of fulfillment in Joshua chapter 8. Now, this next story is really pretty hilarious in one sense, although the Israelites probably didn't think so at the time. This is the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites are a people who are very powerful in Canaan at this time. They were warriors, and yet they understood we have no chance. Like if we go up against the God of Israel, and if we go up against the Israelites, we're going to be like Jericho, and it's not going to go well. So here's what the Gibeonites did. They sent a delegation to the Israelites, but instead of coming in like war gear, they put them all in like tattered clothes. They literally gave them like moldy bread and worn out shoes. They sent them up to the Israelite camp, and they said, "Oh, we are a people from far away." And they said this, "When we left, our shoes were brand new. Our bread was fresh baked. Our clothes were just off the shelf. But now that we've traveled this really, really long way, we're from so far away, please make a covenant with us because we've heard of your God and we know he's powerful. Please make a covenant. We'll be kind of on your side." At which point the Israelites didn't go back to God and ask him, which again implies what? Relationship with God is more important than simply carrying out God's commands in a strict fashion. And the Gibeonites secured this peace treaty. The people of Israel swore, okay, we aren't going to harm you. At which point then they realized, oh, the Gibeonites are actually the people right next door that we're supposed to go attack next. And here's another, kind of exception, quote unquote, to the rule. Rather than annihilating the Gibeonites and saying, you tricked us. Of course, they were under oath by God, but even so, what did they do to the Gibeonites? They forced them into subjugated labor, essentially. Okay, they made them vassals and forced servants of the people of Israel. So the Gibeonites came away with their lives, at which point, again, the point wasn't to exterminate all people in the promised land. And look at this, Joshua 9:24. This is what the Gibeonites said, okay? Think about this. The Gibeonites said this, "It was clearly communicated to your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all of the inhabitants of the land before you. We greatly feared for our lives because of you, and that's why we did this." So they're giving the explanation as to why they tricked the Israelites. Why? Because we heard of the command of Moses, but apparently we didn't, it was almost like, well, we're not going to leave. We're going to stay here. Oh, wait, that was a bad decision. So now we've got to come up with a plan B because we chose to stay and didn't obey. Now we're going to have to come and try and create this treaty. So the Gibeonites weren't killed, but they were forced into servitude. Okay? Next major story in Joshua is in Joshua 10. And this is where basically at this point, the middle campaign has been accomplished, all right? And now the people of Israel are attacking the southern part of Canaan, but all of the southern kings come together and they say, okay, we're either going to die alone or die together, so let's join forces. They fight against Joshua and the people of Israel, but this was that famous battle where God hurled hail from heaven and he made the sun stand still, at which point, basically the point there, excuse me, is that the sun was in the eyes of the enemies all day long, basically preventing them from fighting effectively against the Israelites. And there's a huge psalm about it in Joshua chapter 10. You can read it there. We're not going to take the time to go over it in detail. But basically, they attribute this miracle to God, saying God literally made the sun stand still in order to fight for us. At which point, a lot of the more kind of, miracle deniers out there will go and say, well, God couldn't make the sun stand still. Like, what would happen to the gravitational pull of the earth? Or what would happen to, how could the sun stand still? At which point, I don't think that God is looking for us to, make up a naturalistic explanation as to, maybe the mountain up top was really reflective and God reflected the light of the sun or whatever. If God spoke and made the sun, I think he can figure that out. Okay. So I'm not going to lose sleep over figuring out exactly how that happened, but here's the point again. Just like in Jericho, God made the walls tumble. Who gets the glory for the victory in Joshua 10? God does, right? It's not simply that the Israelites are powerful, it's that the God of the Israelites is powerful. All glory goes to God for the victory. Okay? The conquest is going to continue for the next several chapters, but here's the amazing thing. And this will become more important again as we go. You know, there's a lot of as we go, isn't there? There's a lot at the end. We're going to do a lot at the end tonight, okay? But as you get to Joshua 13, Joshua at different times speaks of the fact that, we took over the entire promised land and we did it all. We routed everyone. It was total victory. But in Joshua 13, you have Joshua who's advanced in age at this point. They've basically achieved victory in the central, in the south, and in the north region of Canaan. But there are several areas that had yet to be conquered. And there's a list there. You can read it in Joshua chapter 13. Although, here's what the Israelites basically did. They went in and established, okay, we're in control, but they didn't kill everyone. At which point the question is, okay, well, if God commanded them to annihilate, why didn't they do that? And there are several different reasons, even in the text that's given, but here's the point. Apparently, the language of exterminating everyone, some would argue, was meant to be kind of hyperbolic. In other words, like, we came in and destroyed you. We came in and defeated you completely. Everyone was basically subjected to the Israelites. They had to recognize the Israelites kind of ruled the roost at this point. But there were several groups of people who remained in the promised land, at which point that's going to cause problems later. You can think of the Philistines or you can think of other groups. But this is the point where the transition happens in Joshua between conquest and now they're going to stop fighting together as a nation. What they're going to do at this point is divide the land between the tribes, and now it's each individual tribe's job to basically continue the conquering of the peoples that are in their particular region. Does that make sense? Each tribe is responsible for whatever people continues there. The division of the land takes up the next several chapters. And this is very interesting because it gives very particular divisions and markers and all of those things. Also, there are some peculiarities here. For instance, the tribe of Joseph, you may notice, doesn't exist when it comes to the division. Actually, his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, both receive a portion of the promised land, at which point you have 12 land inheriting tribes because Joseph is divided into two. And you have one tribe, the Levites, who don't receive any land or area of land at all. They receive individual cities all over the promised land, but they don't have like a Levite region of the promised land. And that's going to come into play throughout the Old Testament just as kind of a geographical point of interest. But here's some things I want to show you with this real quick. Okay, first is you have Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, that each of them actually are allotted portions outside of Canaan. So on the east side of the Jordan River, you see it up here? East side of the Jordan River, Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, they have basically pasture lands that are a little bit better for the livestock that they have. And so they request from Moses, and it's granted, that they basically can receive this land on this side of the Jordan River. Now, again, I think that points to the fact that the point of the promised land wasn't just, hey, we need to secure this particular location. The point was that God, who again owns all of the earth, has an inheritance that he wants to give his people that's beyond just simply the borders of a river or the borders of one particular sea. I think we see a foreshadow there. But in any case, it's very interesting that Caleb, you remember Caleb the spy who actually got to go in? He was the first one to receive a portion of the promised land. Whenever they actually started dividing up the land, Caleb was the first to receive an inheritance. Joshua, interestingly, is the last one to receive an inheritance. So you actually have Joshua and Caleb who come back and feature in the story here. As they're dividing the land, this is basically how it kind of pans out. You can see the map there. And you can also see that when it comes to like Galilee is up in this region. Okay, there's like the Sea of Galilee up here. Anyway, it's not exactly prime real estate where Jesus was from. At which point, when Andrew replies, "What good can come from Nazareth?" Nazareth wasn't like by Jerusalem. It wasn't like in the great area. It was in the booties. It was in, some would describe it as kind of the armpit of Israel. And so Jesus wasn't from somewhere famous. But again, it all comes back to these ancient divisions of the land. Now, when it came to the Levites once again were scattered. They had 48 cities that they could live in. And here's kind of the point. The Levites did what? They represented God before the people and the people before God. So God intentionally scatters the Levites all throughout the land so that they could basically be, a kind of like informal judicial system. If you had a question, go to the Levites. Also, there were 6 cities of refuge where someone could go if they were accused of, say, a crime of of murder, and they said it was an accident. They could go to these cities of refuge, and there were 6 of those throughout the Promised Land as well. Okay, and we're kind of gonna come back and talk about some of the difficult questions in just a second, but I want to get through the rest of kind of the content of Joshua. Fascinating story at the end of Joshua. Like I said, you have Reuben, Gad, the half tribe of Manasseh that live east of the Jordan away from everybody else. Well, once the land has been conquered, Joshua says to those people, hey, you're good to go back over on your side of the Jordan. Well, when they do, they erect an altar on the other side of the Jordan. And the other Israelites, right, the other kind of 9.5 tribes, or 10.5, depending on how you count, they basically look to their brothers and they say, well, wait a minute. Don't forget the covenant we made that said we're only going to serve God. They thought that their brothers were building an altar to foreign gods. They thought that they were already going astray, at which point they said, okay, if you're going to act like foreigners, we're going to have to take you out too. So they gear up for war. They go over to their brothers across the Jordan, at which point the brothers basically say, wait, hold on. You got it wrong. And this is so fascinating, and it gives us a window. It's not just a story. It gives us a window into the purpose of Joshua. Why is he telling the story in the first place? Gad, Reuben, and the half tribe of Manasseh say, the reason we set up this altar is we want all of the future generations to know we serve the same God as our brothers across the river. They knew there was going to be a natural boundary. They knew that in the future there would be a temptation to say, oh, well, those Israelites, maybe they're our distant cousins, but hey, we're going to do our own thing. So they built an altar that looked exactly like the altar of the tabernacle to say, no, we serve one and the same God. The fear was on the part of the 10 tribes that these people were breaking away and forming kind of their own tabernacle. Moses said, don't do that. There's going to be a place where my name dwells. But again, the tribe of Gad, Reuben, and the half tribe of Manasseh say, no, we're still with you. We wanted it to be a sign for all generations that we serve one and the same God. And here's why that story is important. 1, it's interesting, but 2, it shows that the emphasis of Joshua is in what we see at the end. Choose this day who you will serve. Are you going to serve the God of the Canaanites? They're still scattered, right? There are still people around, and they're going to try to entice you to serve their gods. Choose this day whom you will serve. Are you going to be faithful to the God of Israel, or are you going to fall prey to the seduction of worshiping all the God of the Canaanites? Now, if you're not familiar with the rest of the Old Testament, what happens to Israel? They worship all of these other gods. They worship Baal, they worship, pick a god. God eventually says to him, he says, this is the prophets, you prostitute yourself on all of the high places, and you basically serve any god who you can think of. But at least in this moment, and this is where the generation that takes over the promised land really does kind of shine. At least in this moment, for the first generation, they say, no, we want to serve the Lord, and we want to serve him alone. And so civil war's averted. They actually leave more excited than they had ever been, because they had reaffirmed the need to worship Yahweh and to not fall away. At which point this leads us to Joshua's exit. Joshua first gives credits to God for the victories in Joshua 23:3. He urges the Israelites to continue worshiping the Lord alone. That's a famous passage, as for me and my house. Or no, that's going to come later. But he says this, he gives credit to God. Look at this passage in 23:15. I am now going the way of the whole earth. And you know with all your heart and all your soul that none of the good promises the Lord your God made to you has failed. Everything was fulfilled for you. Not one promise has failed. Joshua gives all credit to God, and he says essentially, guys, look at the promises that God has kept. God brought us out of Egypt. It's been a long time. You were kids when it happened. But look at the promises that he's kept. He brought us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. He brought us through the Red Sea. He brought us through the wilderness. He defeated all those people that wanted to kill us along the way. He gave us the promised land. He's topped the sun to give us a victory. Now he says, remember that God has kept all of his promises. At which point in Joshua 24, Joshua basically does a recap of Israel up to that time, going all the way back to Abraham. And going up to Joshua 24, he recaps Israel's history, and then he tells them, put away foreign gods. Don't mess with them. Don't adulterate yourself. And he says, as for me and my house, we will serve Yahweh. And then in the end, they respond by renewing the covenant once again in the presence of God. Interestingly, it says that Joshua recorded it. Another good reason to think Joshua is the author. And then the story ends, and don't miss the significance of this. Do you remember Joseph all the way back in Genesis, at the end of Genesis? What did Joseph say to the Israelites? He said, don't leave my bones buried in Egypt. Take my bones back with you when God takes you to the promised land. Well, guess what they do? When Joshua dies, when Eleazar dies, who is the son of Aaron, so he's the high priest during this time, Joseph, Eleazar, and Joseph are all buried in the promised land. God's promises had come to fruition. The Israelites have total control, although there are still foreigners in the land. And Joshua's task at this point is complete. Now, here are some of the difficulties that Joshua raises. Okay? Does God command the slaughter of innocents? And just to put the sharpest point on it that we know how can we justify a God who tells the people of Israel to go slaughter infants? How could they possibly be guilty of the sin that it would take to justify killing them? Okay? Does the text use exaggerated language to describe the conquest of Canaan? It's a related question, but a little bit separate. And how do we understand this rule of harem, right? Of holy war in the Jewish mindset? Does it still apply? How did they understand it? These are some of the most difficult questions in terms of understanding and defending, really, the Old Testament. So let's talk about these. And we're going to leave time for discussion right after we're done with these. So the evil of the Canaanites. This is the first thing to remember. When it comes to the Canaanites, God had predicted 400 years in advance that eventually he was going to judge the Canaanites. But here's what he said to Abraham. He says, listen, I'm going to judge them, but not now, because the fullness of their evil has not yet come to fruition. It's still ripening. So what does God mean when he says, okay, their wickedness is ripening? Well, here's the thing. People suggest, scholars suggest that the Canaanites essentially were a people who mimicked the behavior of their gods. Okay, so they had a pantheon of gods. They were polytheistic. They had many, many gods that they served, and they would essentially mimic their behavior. So here's for instance, they had fertility gods, right? Baal was a fertility god, the god of thunder and rain, okay? Which is why, by the way, when Elijah says it's not going to rain for 3.5 years, what was he trying to prove? You're worshiping God, or you're worshiping Baal, the god of rain. Well, guess who really controls the rain? Yahweh does, okay? But he was also a fertility god. So literally what they thought was the fertility gods, in order for them to make things fertile here, they had to be sexually aroused, at which point, how do you sexually arouse the gods? Well, you have to perform sexual acts yourselves in order to entice the gods, which is why in their temples they had what? Cult prostitutes. Okay, so it was a very sexualized culture. It was a very wicked culture where they would literally sacrifice their children, for instance, to Molech, right? They would sacrifice their children to the gods. And it's described here in Leviticus 18. Sins included child sacrifice, incest, bestiality, homosexuality. All of these were described in Leviticus 18 as the sins which the people who live in the land that you're about to take, these are sins that those people are committing. At which point God was saying to the Israelites, do not accept the practices of the people who live in the promised land. All right? So, and this, by the way, in Leviticus 18, for an Israelite or for a foreigner to accept and embrace the God of Israel, they had to agree to live by his law. Okay, so think Rahab who was a Canaanite, or Ruth later on who became an Israelite. What do they say? Your God will be your God. Your people will be my people. They didn't say we're going to live in Israel, but then we're going to live as foreigners. They said, no, it's all a package deal. If we become part of Israel, we are going to act as Israelites, or according to the Israelite law. Okay? The Canaanites that remained refused to heed God's advance warning. At which point, what do you have? High-handed rebellion on the part of the Canaanites. You know, your God says this is his land. We don't recognize your God. Or, even worse, our gods are stronger than your God, so bring it on. That was their attitude, okay? So, but I think it's important to remember, based upon the fact that God allowed Canaanites to join the promised people, God's point wasn't so much that the Canaanites as a people were evil, so much as it was the religion that they brought with them was also evil. At which point, we see at least part of the reason why God said, no, it can't be like an assimilation process for everyone. You know, it's got to be a hard line. I have to have a holy people, all right? So the evil of the Canaanites. Next, we're going to talk about exaggerated language. And this is something that might be a little bit technical, or a little bit, you know, you may wonder, well, does this really make sense? And let me explain it, and then let me kind of argue the kind of pros and cons of this, okay? Some texts suggest the total destruction of all of the Canaanites, okay? For instance, Joshua 6:21, that's referring to Jericho. Joshua 10:4, that's again like the kind of committee of kings that came together to fight against Joshua. But in each of those texts, and I'm going to look, for instance, in Joshua 10:4, here's what Joshua 10:4 says. No, that's wrong. I must have put the wrong text on there. Okay. Anyway, I'll look at 11:16 through 20. Okay. Here's what 11:16 through 20 says. Come on, 11:16 through 20. Joshua took all this land, the hill country, all the Negev, all the land of Goshen, all of the different lands. It says in verse 17, he captured all their kings and struck them down, putting them to death. Okay? And then in the end of verse 20, he completely destroyed them without mercy, and he annihilated them just as the Lord God had commanded Moses. But here's the problem. You have these kind of like statements of total destruction, but then later in the story, you have people from those lands who are apparently still living. At which point the question is, well, which is it? Were they totally destroyed, every one of them? Or is it possible that Joshua wasn't claiming literally that he destroyed all of the people? Perhaps he's claiming that he destroyed all their kings or all of their armies. Or perhaps he's saying he destroyed all of the people who resisted or rebelled. And here's why, you might think, well, that just seems like kind of a flimsy argument. Look at this. It says this, after Joshua and the Israelites completely destroyed their enemies, they still remained. You can look at Joshua 13, 15, 16. In 16:10, it's interesting because it says they conquered them, but then they made them forced laborers. Okay, well, apparently they didn't then kill everyone. There were some people that they allowed to live. At which point, again, the argument is that in the kind of military language of we totally got them, we completely destroyed them. Well, maybe it didn't mean literally killed everyone. Maybe it meant secured total victory over everyone. Okay, so it's also possible, some argue, that the language of destruction, we destroyed them, refers to it does not refer, how did I say it there? The language of destruction, I should have said it refers to combatants. I said non-combatants. It's exactly the opposite. It says that the language of destruction refers to combatants in the war, rather than kind of the full idea that, hey, indiscriminate destruction, we're going to go and we're going to kill everyone. All right? We'll talk about that more, I'm sure, in question time. Okay? Last, does the harem still apply? The answer to that is basically no. And notice this. I think this is helpful to understand to some degree. Notice that the harem of total destruction did not apply to all military cases. Okay? So it wasn't like every time the Israelites went to war, God said, hey, this is Karam, totally destroy everyone. No, that wasn't the case. There were special instances, and by the way, this wasn't left up to the Israelites to decide. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to go to war and it's going to be holy war. You know, we're going to, in other words, it wasn't like, oh, the Pope declared a crusade's a holy war, so because the Pope says it, we're going to go do it. This is what the Crusades basically said was happening. That didn't happen, even in the Old Testament. It wasn't like the people got to decide it. You had to have a special revelation from God through a prophet who said God has dedicated a particular group or a particular people for destruction. So the harem was not universal, and it never was. It was also founded on the belief that all life belongs to God, and therefore God can authorize human agents to act on his behalf if he so desires. So the idea is God is ultimately in control, God is the authority, and if he decides to delegate part of his authority to people, that's God's prerogative to do so. That's the theological principle that the Karam is built upon. But, and this is something we just have to be honest about, this holy war mentality has been used by Christians in illegitimate ways. I mean, obviously, you think about even what Jesus said, there's nothing that Jesus said that would have ever indicated that holy war was continued or in any way acceptable on this side of the cross. So, in other words, it was very limited to begin with, all right? And unfortunately, it's been misapplied in the New Testament era. We can talk about that more, but here's our takeaways, and then we're going to go to questions. Again, how can we apply this? First, victory belongs to the Lord, not to the people. Okay? Same principle in our life. We can't strive to do things on our own and expect that God's going to come and help. It's God's victory that we are then relying upon and following after. Notice this, God's promises remain true despite human failure. Again, like we talked about last week, even though this generation, for the most part, was faithful to obey, you still had people like Achan, or you still had people who were afraid to do what God asked them to do. God's faithful and his promises remain true, even when the people fail. All right? There was, and this is a key one too, in Israel, the threat was basically always the same. It was always the same. Are you going to be a holy people, or are you going to assimilate to the culture around you? At which point, the choice is really 1-to-1, right? Choose this day whom you will serve. Well, we have the exact same problem. It is an apples-to-apples comparison. Are we going to be separate while still living within the culture, or are we going to totally assimilate our ways so that there's no distinction between the people of God and the people of the world? Okay? This next one I want you to lean into. Notice that even in Joshua, the greatest military leader in Israel's history, they did not achieve a full victory. At which point, again, this was like a highlight moment of Israelite history, but there was still another victory that was needed. And it's very interesting. The name of Jesus was Yeshua or Joshua. And don't miss that. Someone who would come and save his people from their sins. Joshua means salvation, but also someone who could achieve victory over the enemies of God. And yet, what do we see in the New Testament? Jesus' victory wasn't simply a physical victory like with the first Joshua. It was a victory over the powers of darkness that ruled the nations, that even at that point had invaded the promised land. But then throughout the book, there's a foreshadowing of God's promises all along the way. Rahab, for instance, shows up in the genealogy of Jesus, proves that God's purpose, even in giving the Israelites the promised land, was that the Gentiles would eventually come in. And it's worth noting that even in the genealogy of Jesus, you have Rahab, you have Ruth, you have Tamar, you have Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. You have those four women who are what? All Gentiles. Uriah the Hittite, someone who is a Gentile who again was grafted into Israel. So you have Gentile women who are included in the genealogy of Jesus, showing, by the way, Matthew chapter 1, Gentiles, right? Included in the genealogy. What do you have? The very last thing that Matthew says, go into all the nations. The book of Matthew, which is the most Jewish of all the Gospels, is bookended by the command and the example of reaching Gentiles. Again, going back to Genesis 12. God's purpose is foreshadowed even in Joshua through Rahab, okay? Questions. I hope we have questions. There's a lot to discuss, so but I want to leave time for questions. Yeah. Yes. No, I don't think so. Although you do have Caleb. Caleb, it's very interesting. You read that story. Caleb is basically like, I was here 40 years ago and I think we could have beat him then. I'm an old man now, but let me at him. He was just like, we'll go take the hill. I may be old, but it's kind of like that song, I ain't as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I ever was. That was Caleb's attitude. You got to love Caleb. Yeah. 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 I thought that exact same thing when I read that. I was like, why didn't they get circumcised in the wilderness? I don't know. Why didn't Moses circumcise his kids? I don't know. It's really weird. Maybe, again, this is like an off-the-cuff explanation. Maybe they were waiting to do the circumcision when they got into the Holy Land, right? If the circumcision is a ritual of cleansing, of separation, maybe they wanted to wait until they actually went in. I don't know. I don't know why they waited. That's a really good question. But it does prove God's faithful even when you're not circumcised, right? Paul picks up on that big time in the New Testament. When did the promise to Abraham come? Before he had been circumcised. Genesis 12, Paul's not circumcised. Abraham's not circumcised till, I think, Genesis 17. So, yeah, the timeline is important. Other questions? Again, the killing of infants is probably the hardest part, right? How can we justify the killing of children and infants? And there are a lot of really bad ways to do that. And honestly, there's a book out there if you're interested in this, because for some people it's like really, really bothersome. And I understand that. It's disturbing. There was a guy named Paul Copan, wrote a book called Is God a Moral Monster? He deals in depth with some of these questions. But I think it's worth remembering two things. Like one, God reserves the right over all life, right? And also the argument could be made that by giving those infants into the hands of God rather than the hands of their wicked parents, you are achieving an eternal security for them that otherwise they wouldn't have received. Now, again, the danger of that is, okay, well then why doesn't a mom with 5 kids just drive her, car off the road so that she can, quote unquote, save them? And the reason is because God commands her not to. Whereas in this case, God commands the Israelites directly to act on his behalf. It's hard. It is hard. That's why, though, some people argue that the language of total destruction refers to combatants. And we could talk about those arguments all night long, but I do want to throw that out there because it is real. This is, although I want you to think about it like this. Here's what I think is hard for us to swallow. You think of the flood. The flood is just as universal as the annihilation of Canaan, except even more so because it's actually the entire world, right? Most of us would recognize God's authority in destroying the entire world as long as he's the one who does it. I think the problem we have is God delegating authority to humans to do something that if he does it, well, he's God. At which point, God again reserves the right to delegate his authority to others as well, in special circumstances where he clearly does it. This is not to say that it's somehow programmatic for all people at all times. Again, the Karam was something that wasn't even applied consistently in the book of Joshua, much less all throughout Israel's history. And it was only applied when it was very clearly received, a word from God to a prophet who was authoritative. They didn't vote on it. They didn't say, oh, we hate those people, we're going to call out the Karam. No, it was, we've received a word from God, and apparently somehow in his providence he's commanded this. Okay. Anything else? We're out of time. I'll stick around here in a minute. Yeah, Rayon.
is where you're at.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And
And-
I thought, gee, did that brilliant statement come out of my mouth? And that was actually a turning point for me.
yeah. Yeah.
He is in control, and it doesn't matter. I mean, we all die anyway.
Right. Right. At which point, again, the argument is, was God somehow preserving in the only way that was possible, their innocence that would not have been true later in life had they lived? Again, that's where we have to, at some point, throw up our hands and say, God is authoritative over us, but also we can't fully understand God's ways. Yeah. All right. Hey, thank you so much. Like I said, if you want to keep talking, I'm going to be around. And next week, we're going to hit Judges. All right? Thank you.